guilty or not guilty. That is the way the justice system is supposed to work. That did not happen in this case. There was no trial. The defense coerced the state bar of North Carolina to bring charges against the district attorney, who felt he had to recuse himself. He did recuse himself and turned the case over to the state attorney general of North Carolina, who conducted a secret 4-month investigation, declared these kids innocent. That is not even a word that is used in the legal profession. I believe that's not even a word that is used in jurisprudence. I'm not a lawyer. The Duke then felt the need to make this go away, to pay each of those 3 kids that were indicted $20 million each. The party on March 13th of 2006 cost Duke University $100 million. Okay, there was no trial, there was no justice, and the justice system was subverted. So, you want to talk about inequality and the way inequality works on Wall Street? We can have that discussion. We can also have a discussion about how it works in the justice system. There is inequality all around, and it is destroying, I think, what made our country great. So I'll be quiet and turn it over.
Good evening. Wow. Don't y'all just want to go out in the streets? I mean, I felt that way after House of Cards. But now, you've given me fresh anger. Thank you all for having me here this evening. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I want to also thank my friend who's here with me this evening. One of my dearest friends, my best man at my wedding. One of the best men at my wedding, Keith Coleman, who came out from California this morning with his 6-year-old son, both of whom woke up at 4 a.m. to get a flight to Newark, and will spend the weekend with me and my family. And I am so grateful to have him here because he's followed my work for a long time. I follow his, but I say that also because I have to warn you all that because we both have 6-year-olds who are without dad, there's a good chance I'll have to leave early in order to get back to make sure that his son, in full, is comfortable away from home without dad. I'm not going to talk so much about income inequality. I am concerned about Wall Street, but that's not the focus of my work. I want to talk more about structural inequality. And I do want to begin by taking up Bruce's question at the end of his remarks, because I think there is an answer about why it's important to go after economic inequality. I think there are actually some fairly simple and straightforward reasons that need not be difficult to find. I mean, first of all, it really offends our values as a nation not to concern ourselves with the plight of college students who can't find jobs when they graduate, who have difficulty obtaining credit, who graduate with tremendous amounts of debt, people for whom the rules about mobility have just changed dramatically compared to the experiences of their parents. There's something deeply wrong about that. There's something deeply wrong, not just from a moral standpoint, but from the standpoint of our social compact about mobility, where people work hard, when people are constitutionally given rights to access and opportunity and consistently denied, not just on the basis of class, but on the basis of race. That this is a problem of continuing discrimination in this country. So there are many ways that we might look at the problem of economic inequality as a problem in desperate need of an answer. Ways that go to the heart of our identity as a republic, to our founding documents, to our the basis of our political system. What I try to do in my most recent book, The Price of Paradise, is to follow the subtitle. The subtitle of the book is The Price of Paradise, The Costs of Inequality and a Vision for a More Equitable America. And so while I'm happy to discuss the moral arguments in favor of ending inequality, the legal arguments in favor of inequality to the extent that it's rooted in discrimination, and some of our general concerns about following basic American principles, I think it's also important to look at the costs to communities, the costs to families that are quantifiable. It's not just a runaway system, and it's not just a system that's problematic because of what 0.1% get. It's also a system that implicates many of us, perhaps many of us even in this room. So I want to alter the conversation a little bit more and start talking a bit about the costs of structural inequality and what a different kind of conversation it is. So structural inequality is a different conversation than income inequality. They're both economic in nature, but we look at different things when we look at structure. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the wrong way. Somebody's fooling me. Thank you. So we look at place, we look at current demographic dynamics, we look at history, we look at race and socioeconomic class. We don't hide from those subjects. We look at process, and we look ultimately at equity. Perhaps the strongest argument in favor of doing something about inequality is that so much of inequality, or rather of outcomes that are quantifiably unequal are the result of processes that are deliberately inequitable and therefore unfair. Folks, I'm sorry. All right, so beginning with place. Place has become perhaps the most accurate proxy for determining our access to economic opportunity. It's where our resources lie. So while it's important to look at what hedge fund managers do, it's also important to look at what people within our own municipalities do, what our state laws do in order to create seats of economic resources located within the municipalities where we live. It's not just neighborhoods, but it's also entire municipalities and how they're able to leverage political resources to turn them into economic resources. What we're ultimately concerned with is the extent to which where we live helps to determine our opportunities for increasing our human capital and that of our children. So where you live says a lot about your family's access to resources or the lack thereof. So for instance, in Chatham, which is a very well-to-do town, and many of you are probably more familiar with it than I am, having just moved to New Jersey after teaching here for almost 20 years. Just got here about 3 years ago, but you see enormous disparities in tax base per capita compared to really a more working class town like Fairview here in Bergen. And that's quite a spread between the tax base per capita of 258,000 versus 82,000. It's also reflected, of course, in the 3-to-1 ratio of median family income between Chatham and Fairview. And we've also seen that places like Chatham have attracted an enormous amount of private sector job growth, whereas places like Fairview, which in fact have increased in population, but not in tax base, are also losing jobs. So beyond place as a municipality, increasingly we look at regions. The comparison reveals basic measures of inequality between places. So here's, I can stretch out, this one's gonna be tough to see from craning my neck. So here are a bunch of towns, just to give you an idea of the struggle that's happening inside many of North Jersey's towns. See, the 6 towns in the top, West Orange, Belleville, Bloomfield, South Orange, Maplewood, Montclair, and Irvington, I guess that's 7, represent important trends in the New Jersey. So in the last 20 years or so, but especially in the last 15, we've seen enormous demographic shifts. So West Orange, for instance, has seen a change in the percentage of Black and Hispanic K-12 students of 20% since 2000. It's also reflected, just using West Orange again as an example, in the number of students who receive free and reduced lunch. Free and reduced lunch is a proxy measure of poverty. You receive either free or reduced lunch if your incomes are 130% or less of poverty. So it's 18%. So here's a town, West Orange, that has had to absorb this amount of demographic shift from what it had been just 14 years ago. Belleville, a 29% change in its Black and Hispanic elementary school population, a 20% change in the number of students who are coming from more impoverished homes. Then you have some towns that have experienced a fair amount of gentrification, Montclair and Irvington. I happen to live in Montclair, a very diverse town, a town that has worked very hard on its reputation for diversity, both economically and racially, but it has still, in part because of market forces, sort of won out in the battle of municipalities, and seen actually a drop in the number of poor students in its schools and a drop in its Black and Hispanic population. Irvington has pretty much held steady. But then you see towns like Millburn, Livingston, and Roseland that have simply not budged in that time. They are wealthy towns for the most part. They've seen enormous job growth. Most of you who have friends in law firms in New Jersey know somebody who works in Roseland. But as you see, they're not diverse places, not economically and not by race and ethnicity. And that's held true for a long time. So something is happening within the same region, that certain towns are bearing a particular burden when it comes to finding ways to produce opportunity for their increasingly Black and Hispanic students in the public schools, and some are not. So we look at current dynamics such as rates of job growth, transportation developments, and demographic change. And now we see another set of comparisons based on median family income. And this was produced by the consortium of organizations working under the Sustainable Communities Initiative by the Obama administration. It's called Together North Jersey, and perhaps some of you have seen some of the talks. It's run out of the Blaustein School at Rutgers in Brunswick. But this shows that we have continuing growing inequality. In 1990, towns in the 95th percentile had a tax base per capita that was 2.6 times greater than towns in the 5th percentile, and today that gap has grown to 3.1. So you see in Seaside, Parkboro, in Ocean County, a tax base per capita of 255,000, but down in Plainfield, in Union, an increasingly Latino area, 35,654. I mean, just draconian differences in the capacity of these towns to provide services for, public services for their residents based on property taxes, which, as we know in New Jersey, is really the mother's milk of public services. So we look at history and we ask why a given place has developed as it has, or failed to develop, and we try to determine why some places have experienced significant changes and why others seem fixed. And of course, a lot of the story in New Jersey is probably well known to many of you, and it really is a legacy of local sovereignty or localism, the ideological commitment to local control. And what that has meant from a legal standpoint in terms of the exercise of police powers, that if they're ever challenged for their discriminatory effects, can plead that it's all non-racial, that it's facially neutral, and according to our jurisprudence, will receive only rational basis review. And so most of those policies that are very important to a sense of civic pride and participatory democracy have nonetheless produced these kinds of enormous inequalities across regions. And it's a difficult thing to look at, because it's not something, because of its sort of colorblind nature, that many of us are aware of. We're not always aware of the exclusionary effects of so much of the decision making that many of you may understand as fiscal zoning, but its legacy is quite clear and demonstrated in some of the statistics I just showed. Its legacy is also quantifiable in terms of some basic measures of housing distribution. So again, we can use some housing variables such as public housing, and in a moment I'll show you multifamily housing, to explore this history of exclusion based on, for the most part, zoning decisions, but other kinds of decisions as well. So here is the concentration of public housing units across these 4 North Jersey counties. And so if you're in the dark brown, you see 13 to 27 units per 1,000 people. And you see where they're concentrated, almost entirely in Essex County and almost entirely in the southeastern portion of Essex County, including, of course, Newark. And you see the same thing in Passaic, where so much of it is located in Passaic. So it's sprinkled throughout, but what is perhaps most amazing about a map like this, and you see the municipality list on the far left, is how many places have none. And this, of course, is not accidental. This is rooted in our laws, in the National Housing Act, and the fact that the placement of public housing had to be made voluntary. The siting of public housing had to be made voluntary by the municipalities that would agree to have it. And so, of course, that opens it up to the political process, and many, of course, just stepped out. They just excluded themselves from the debate. They didn't want public housing, and therefore they wouldn't get the people that public housing brings, and the costs associated with them. Now, we have a long and tortured legal history of the fight over multifamily units, which is at the heart of so much Euclidean zoning, but specifically the Mount Laurel decision in 1975 and the history thereafter, about a 40-year history of litigation that ultimately led to passage in 1985 of the New Jersey Fair Housing Act. And under the Fair Housing Act, like the Mount Laurel Doctrine itself, announced by the New Jersey Supreme Court, there is a right to shelter in this state, and there is a requirement that communities maintain their regional fair share of affordable housing. So there's a fair share that every municipality in the state of New Jersey has based on a variety of increasingly complicated formula developed by the Council on Affordable Housing. And of course, you know, this is very much in the news right now. COA is being dragged back to the table because the New Jersey Supreme Court has said that its most recent formula, growth share, for determining fair share is problematic and unconstitutional and has to be reformed. But COA, under this administration, is not particularly interested in doing that, but is now, just this past week, offering some of its latest solutions and taking public comment. This is the map, however, that indicates how, depending on your point of view, how little progress has been made or how much progress has been made. And again, you can see that multifamily housing is in many New Jerseyans and across the country, many Americans' minds, the equivalent of allowing poor people in. It is the same thing as affordable housing. It is bad for property values. It is bad for the school system. It is bad for the character of the town, and we have a right to determine that character in our own interest, to compete as towns across a kind of an economic, geographic landscape. And the last thing we want is to bring in burdens like multifamily housing units. And so you see the concentration again, in particular, especially urbanized places. And then we look at race and socioeconomic class implications, especially as they correlate to concentrations of both wealth and poverty. And the maps recreate themselves. So here are Hispanic populations, again, 52% to 98% in brown, and or in light brown, 30% to 51%. This is by block group, so rather granular census measure. But in the larger scheme of things, the same picture emerges, that the Hispanic population in northern New Jersey is concentrated in a few eastern parts of Essex and Passaic County, and of course in Union County, and parts of Bergen as well. Not a lot of penetration, not the kind of penetration that you would have expected after 20 years of a Fair Housing Act and 50 years of, almost 50 years of a National Fair Housing Act. Perhaps worse, not by a lot, but again, the concentration of African American populations, again, the same places. You would expect under an anti-discrimination regime that we would have had by now, much greater penetration, at least in these 4 counties, of African American populations. We have not. And there are many things we might say about this that may or may not reflect structural inequality, but when you then see, when you overlay families in poverty with the last 2 maps, you see the strong correlation between concentrations of Black and Latino families in certain overburdened parts of the region and families in poverty. These are not high growth areas. These are not, these are places with suffering extreme fiscal stress. And they are frankly unable to manage the load that's been thrust upon them. So what we see is a geography of opportunity, and roughly measurable by place with key elements that correlate strongly with race and class. We mapped as a municipal opportunity index. This is something that David Rusk and Myron Orfield figured out. I can't take credit for it. It combines indicators of job growth, school opportunity based primarily on achievement, 5th grade achievement scores, municipal service quality, income, and poverty levels. And so under the municipal opportunity index, areas, I'm about to show you the map, so this is your legend, areas high in opportunity are green or blue, while areas low in opportunity are shown here in shades of yellow. That's where the money is. What's red are central cities. So this took a long time to produce, notwithstanding a Supreme Court that is probably as liberal or progressive as any in the country, some groundbreaking education finance decisions. The Mount Laurel decision is an unbelievably groundbreaking decision. There really isn't a court in the country that has done as much, either to articulate a state constitutional basis for fair share, a recognition of the importance of the right to affordable housing. And yet, despite those and many, many other movements throughout the state in the last 50 years or so, this is the picture of structural inequality. So we ask about the processes that are most responsible for bringing about such unequal outcomes. And inequality, it's important to remember, is an outcome. We're interested in the processes that reproduce it across whole regions. We want to know what rules, policies, and attitudes are responsible for inequality. And mostly we want to know if those processes are fair or equitable, because we expect our laws to be fair. And that is, in essence, how we at Rutgers in the Center on Law and Metropolitan Equity and in a few places around the country now analyze structural inequality through the lens of what we call regional or metropolitan equity. And it's premised on the idea of interdependency, or as Martin Luther King called it in 1963, from a jail cell in Alabama, mutuality, that we are all here, that we live life in inescapable bonds, in inescapable networks of mutuality tied in a single fabric of destiny, where what happens to one of us happens to others. And this is clearly true on a municipal basis. I mean, it may be true on a human basis, but it is clearly true that what one municipality does economically affects its neighbors, and vice versa. And sometimes that mutuality is parasitic, and sometimes it's more cooperative. But it is increasingly true, and this is especially true in places like New Jersey that have seen such tremendous growth in the population of minorities across the state. But across the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the country, we now have a majority of minority school children. So the coming minority nation is not some fantasy, some projection that analysts like to raise to scare people into giving them grant money. This is the reality that many places are already living. And so when we talk about an unequal access to resources, we have to be clear about whom we're talking. We're talking about people who have traditionally, historically, legally been excluded. And they're having children at a greater rate, populating our schools, and they'll become our labor force a lot sooner, and they will vote. right? And these are the kinds of environments that too many of them are growing up in. And the resource disparities are scary and obvious. They are as obvious to them as the earlier charts are to us in the vulgarity of what the 1% of the 1% of the 1% gets versus the rest of us. So for many of them, they're really not so concerned about what hedge fund managers are making. They're concerned about what people 2 towns over are doing and why they can't be in schools like that, and why they don't have access to transportation corridors, and why they can't get from an inner ring suburb to an outer ring suburb where all the jobs are because it requires a car they don't have. I want to note, by the way, that one of the examples that was repealed in 2008, one of the examples of institutionalized parasitic interdependency was the Regional Contribution Agreement. And some of you familiar with Mount Laurel may know what that meant. So it meant that a town under the Fair Housing Act was able to buy out half of its Mount Laurel obligation, its fair share housing obligation. So think about that. If your town was obligated to build 30 units of affordable housing, you could, it's all monetized. You could take 15 of those units and go on the open market to places that have a disproportionate number of poor people and therefore need more affordable housing, like Patterson. And say Patterson will give you the money for these 15 units. And you could literally buy out your obligation to a desperate city that would only make poverty more concentrated in Patterson. But it was worth your while. Now, this was repealed in 2008, but I know there are people in this room who are aware of towns west of here that buy up open space for the same reason. I mean, they're willing to tax themselves in order to maintain exclusion. That's my last slide. I don't want to end without suggesting something in the way of solutions. This is a quick review. You got it? That's what I do at the end of class. Okay, everybody, tell me what I said. All right. So what does a metropolitan equity strategy look like? Well, rather than get into the weeds, I would just suggest a few principles that characterize them. First is the integration of resources. You know, it really does follow what Martin Luther King said. We recognize a certain mutuality, and that entails working to integrate resources and each other. So it means working harder from housing mobility strategies that allow affordable housing to be built and for people in areas of low opportunity to move to areas of high opportunity, where they meet enormous resistance still. But it also means the integration of resources. It may not always mean the integration of people. It may mean integrating more of the resources that are captive in particular parts of the state, moving them to areas that need them, based on this notion of an equitable sharing of burdens and benefits. The greatest subsidy that a middle-class community gets, in my view, is not what the IRS gives you for your mortgage deduction. It's the right to exclude. The right to exclude undesirables means that you don't have to pay the costs of bearing those undesirable children in your school. And since we have monetized so many of those costs, exclusion, is a real privilege. And if you were to enjoy that privilege, I mean, the question was asked earlier, why do we let this happen on Wall Street? Why aren't we out in the streets angry about this? The same question could be put to this: why would this be okay? Why is this consistent with our American ideals? It's certainly not consistent with our laws if you look at them through a civil rights lens. But if you look at them through a fiscal lens, it's just fair competition. But we need to lower the costs of inequality to the region because we know that regions that have lower rates of inequality actually grow faster and have more stable labor forces. And we know that deconcentrating wealth and poverty is good because it means that our tax burdens or our potential tax burdens go down. So there's something in it for all of us. And I guess the last thing I would say is that what will continue to happen if we don't do this will be the recognition by emerging populations that this is how the game is played. And people will use what they have. They will use the resources they have in zero-sum fashion to try to beat out those with whom they compete. They will leverage their political power eventually. Now, this is probably off into the future, and I don't think it's a vision of democracy that any of us savor. But we're seeing it in an almost cannibalistic fashion among communities of color, particularly in the Southwest, particularly in places like California, where Black and Latino populations who are sort of fighting for scarce resources are leveraging votes in order to outdo one or the other. So we've seen it. It's it's a quiet history in the United States. We don't want that here. We have apartheid schools in New Jersey. We don't want apartheid relationships. So with that, I think I'll end and turn it over to the Q&A session.
We'll ask our panelists to come to the front, if we could do that. And while they're doing that, I'd like to actually, maybe could get the three of you chatting a little bit before we take some questions from the audience. And as you were all talking, I was really struck by a sort of common theme, which is sort of, or a sort of unspoken theme lurking behind a lot of these topics, whether it's whether it's the growth of top 1/10 of 1%, the lack of Federal Reserve, or the Federal Reserve using its authority to keep our money very cheap for banks, or whether it's the structural inequality across the state. Lurking sort of behind all of those, it seems to me, is a very powerful narrative in American politics, which is that when government seeks to rectify inequality, it is acting, it is doing something. When inequality happens, inequality happens. It happens because people work hard, or because people move different places, or because people do something that changes their lives, and people who don't do those things end up on the bottom. But the fact is, politics happens in every outcome. So politics is at work in the creation of inequality, right? Politics is at work in the creation of the super rich hedge fund managers. Politics is at work in the Fed keeping money cheap. And it seems to me that we don't have a narrative, a very powerful or strong or even visible political narrative from either political party that calls attention to the fact that the context in which we're living is one in which is a feature of and a fact of decision-making, decisions we've made collectively through our representatives to make communities the way they are, to keep money cheap for the rich, to keep the richest richer. And it seems to me we need a counter-narrative to the popular one that says, well, people who are rich worked hard, people who are poor don't. And I wondered if any of you have any thoughts on sort of how we create a political narrative that helps people to understand that the circumstances you're all describing are not natural outcomes of what people are doing. They're outcomes of the rules that we live by, and the rules that get decided by people in positions of authority. So, anybody want to take that up?
Well, I think it begins with a recognition of the difficulty now in doing it at the national level. I think that, part of the subtext of my remarks is to, while I'm critical of so much localism, I'm not critical of all localism. I think there's a lot of beauty in local democracy and community making. But I think that the costs of politics, the expense of politics at the national level, the extent to which each of the major parties is captive to a system of campaign finance that just makes it so impossible to articulate that counter-narrative in any meaningful and sustained way. It makes it too difficult. It's too polarized right now. Whereas, if I give the talk that I just gave or something like it in a Republican county in New Jersey to locally elected officials, they know what I'm talking about because they were elected. If they're an incumbent and there for some time. They were elected by a predominantly white electorate. You know, in the years since, they've suddenly got Latinos in their schools. They've got a smattering of black families all of a sudden. They've got South Asians, they've got East Asians. They have a different set of constituents and their concerns for whom they, as generally very responsible lawmakers and elected officials, I mean, who wants to be a locally elected official unless you're really serious about your community? You know, it's not the place for glamour. So, you know, if that's what you're about, you care about your constituents, and as you see your constituents change and their needs change, you have to either follow and be creative and use all that good experience to good ends, or you need to get out of the way. And I think it's that essential dynamic, that pressure, that leads me to be a little bit more hopeful about articulating the counter-narrative at the local level. Because I think that where the rubber meets the road, where people are really concerned about whether their kid has any meaningful chance of making it to a good college, you know, that they can afford, means they've got to be concerned about the local institutions and how they're funded. And they know that state aid is drying up. And they know that the feds are not coming to the rescue. And they know that property taxes are going way too high and yet are not delivering the level of services that they delivered 15 years ago. And this is terrifying. And so the hope is that out of this terror, there's a sense of, you know, shared purpose. That we got to do something about this. You know, we got to do something about this, not just because we're falling behind New Zealand. We have to do something because we're not who we were. This is uncomfortable.
Well, I guess I would only add to that that it feels like to me that we're kind of reaching a tipping point, a boiling over point, where people, because everywhere I go, I hear people, you know, make comments that you made. The system isn't working. We know that there's gridlock in Washington. I don't see much difference, frankly, between the Republicans and the Democratic Party. I feel like they're basically the same thing, except on the fringes, where people actually get elected. They're basically the same people and talking about the same thing. You know, frankly, you know, I was incredibly moved and hopeful when Barack Obama got elected president in 2008, but as soon as he appointed Tim Geithner and Larry Summers, I thought, well, there goes the hopey changey thing. I mean, how's that working out for you? I mean, literally within weeks, we have that incredible speech he gave in Chicago on the night he was elected, and it was incredibly moving and incredibly hopeful. And then he appoints Larry Summers and Tim Geithner, and you just know that the money people have gotten their hooks into him, and it was just a shock. And basically, people complain on Wall Street about Barack Obama. He's been the most incredible president for Wall Street that I can think of. I mean, the stock market has gone from 6,000 in March of 2009 to 16,000 today, and each day is a new record. The bond market has had this incredible rally. Interest rates, as I said before, have never been lower. I mean, if you're rich, I mean, as we've been talking about, this is the golden age, man. It doesn't get any better. And who's been at the helm of that? Incredibly, Barack Obama. And yet, people on Wall Street complain about this. You know why? They complain because they know it's never been so great. And yet, they want to act like it's never been so bad because, you know, they know that everybody is really quite pissed off at them. So I think that we are reaching the point, and there hasn't been anybody to come along to articulate this in a very effective way. And you know, with all due respect to Elizabeth Warren, I just don't think she's the right vehicle for this kind of. Her message isn't bad, but her presentation and her sanctimonious approach are very unappealing on so many levels.
Bruce, do you want to?
No, I'll pass on this one.
Okay. I guess I just would wanted to ask you whether you, as an economist, find that people don't see the growth of the 0.1% as related to rules passed in various venues, Congress and so on, but as simply people making good on hard work, or whether people acknowledge and recognize that these are a function of changing rules in ways that allow that kind of wealth to accumulate.
Well, I used to study history before I studied economics, and I guess the question I haven't had a chance to look at is whether the inequality that we experienced in the 1920s, where the folks in the 1920s, at least in whatever the conservative parties were in that day, not only extolling their own virtues of hard work and why they were on top, but so keen on kicking the guys who were down at the bottom. So whether that was true in the 20s or not, I don't know.
Well, I'm going to keep a queue for questions, and I'm sure there are many. So one ground rule I would like to lay down is that please, if you have more than one question, just ask one, and you can get back in the queue for another question. I will do my best to keep something in some fair semblance of order. So raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and yes, go ahead.
It seems to me there's one common thread, and that is, I can stand up. I don't usually need to use a mic. It seems to me there's one common thread, and that is that our politicians are bought. You cannot possibly win office without a lot of money, and that's most acute here in the New York metropolitan area. So if we're talking about this part of New Jersey, it certainly means our area. What can we do to get the money out of politics?
I think procedurally we know the answer. It's going to take a constitutional amendment.
How do we get it fixed?
Convince a few billionaires to go after it.
But it's even worse than the obvious. It's worse than just that the politicians are bought and sold, and require so much money to get elected, right? If you look at any of the sort of top 10 givers to campaigns, it's Wall Street. I mean, Goldman Sachs was the top giver to Barack Obama, and they were the top giver to Mitt Romney. And then they hedge their bets. They're like Goldman Sachs is probably the 5th largest giver to Obama. So, and you know what? It really doesn't take that much money to be in the top 10. I mean, Goldman Sachs, makes tens of billions of dollars in profit every year, and for a couple $1 million, they can be the top giver. This is before sort of the super PAC away, and then it gets even worse with the regulators. Okay, and this really irritates me to no end. And I'll just take an example of Robert Khuzami, who you may or may not be aware of, but he was the head of enforcement at the SEC under this SEC chairman named Mary Shapiro, who used to be head of FINRA, which is the Wall Street self-regulatory organization. When she left FINRA to become head of the SEC, FINRA gave her a $9 million going away bonus. And guess what? She was one of the more toothless, we've had a string of toothless SEC chairmen. She was famously one of the most toothless. But Robert Khuzami was hired by her as her chief enforcement officer. In other words, one of the top cops to try to change Wall Street, hold Wall Street accountable for what happened in 2007 and 2008, and to try to change behaviors. Well, Robert Khuzami used to be the general counsel at Deutsche Bank in the Americas. He was the person that signed off on all of the mortgage-backed securities that were issued by Deutsche Bank. When he was head of enforcement at the SEC, he held nobody on Wall Street accountable for their wrong behavior. And then earlier this year, he left the SEC for a $5 million a year job at Kirkland & Ellis, the big Wall Street law firm. So I rest my case there.
Come a little further. Could I point out to a glimmer of hope that's a little bit easier than a constitutional amendment? It's the two of the justices appointed by Obama, Sotomayor and Kagan, have voted against the McCutcheon case. And so have the two other justices appointed by Democratic presidents. 5 of the justices appointed by Republican presidents have voted for McCutcheon, as well as for Citizens United. Is there a beacon of hope there? Can we all work for another Democratic president and hope for the best? Because it's gonna be easier than a constitutional amendment. And what do you say?
It's wow. It's so unlikely. I mean, first of all, we're sort of rolling the dice about, you know, people's lives, the lives of justices sitting on the Supreme Court right now, and hoping that if one of them should perish, we would, during a Democratic president, we should get somebody who would come in, you know, which is its own, you know, we'll put that over here more. But beyond the ethical dilemma there is the practical dilemma of, well then, who brings the case to challenge Citizens United? And on what grounds does the court overturn its precedent, you know, within a couple of years? So I think the answer that this is really about a constitutional amendment, although I don't think that's any more likely, is the right answer though, because what it represents is an acknowledgement that so much of the political process has become captive to finance, that it has permeated the judicial system, whether because of ideological reasons or just because of stare decisis. It's there, and it would be very difficult to overturn, because that's not typically how judges make decisions, certainly not at that kind of constitutional moment. So instead, it really has to come from the people, and that's what a constitutional amendment is. So theoretically, it seems to me that the best way to do it, not the more likely, but the best way to do it is through a constitutional amendment.
If I could just add, as a political scientist in the room, I agree. I don't think a constitutional amendment is going to happen, but I do think that the grassroots mobilization around one this has got to come from bottom up.
Hi, I have a question on economics. I do